impartial jurors who listened to legal cases, delivering their verdicts strictly based on the testimonies and the evidence that has been presented. In one such case that comes to mind, an individual in Los Angeles had been put on trial for murder. And while some of the evidence against him was considered circumstantial, there was also compelling testimony pointing to the defendant's guilt. And a panel of 12 impartial jurors had been chosen to listen to all of the evidence and to objectively decide the defendant's guilt or his innocence. In his closing statement to the jury, the defense attorney for the accused stated, "If there is any doubt in your mind, any inkling of doubt at all about the guilt of my client, you must find him not guilty. And to finally demonstrate my client's innocence, I now ask the bailiff to bring the actual killer in through that door." Well, of course, most of the people in the courtroom turned towards that door to look. It was then that the defense attorney thundered at the jury, "Some of you jurors just now looked over to that door, proving you are not completely convinced that my client committed this crime. You have doubt in your mind, so you must find him innocent." Well, the jury was then released to take as long as they needed to deliberate on a verdict. Less than 3 hours later, the jury returned with a guilty verdict. During the sentencing phase, the defense attorney calmly asked the jury how they had reached their verdict, notwithstanding their obvious doubt. One juror stated, "The evidence against your client was compelling. And admittedly, when you made your closing statement, everyone in the courtroom looked towards that door, except for your client. He knew there was nobody else walking through that door." Well, today's gospel reading about Jesus' transfiguration is a little bit like the trial we were just discussing. There are charges to be addressed. There are witnesses who need to be questioned. There is obviously an element of reasonable doubt which needs to be resolved. There are eyewitness testimonies to be heard. There are those who need to know the truth. And the whole controversy starts just a few verses earlier than today's gospel transfiguration story. Back in chapter 16 of Matthew's gospel, Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do the people say that I am?" That one question, at its core, becomes the very issue that eventually leads to Jesus' persecution. Recall that at this point in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus and his followers are now making their final journey down to Jerusalem, where Jesus will eventually suffer his bitter passion and death by crucifixion. Of course, by this time in his earthly ministry, lots of people have surely heard about Jesus, about some of the marvelous things he has said and done. But they don't really know who he is or what he had come to do. So Jesus is questioning those closest to him about who he really is. And they answer. Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, some say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. In other words, nobody knows who Jesus really is. So Jesus takes his interrogation one step further, asking his very closest followers, "And who do you say I am?" It's a really important question in the context of what's about to take place. And only one answered his question: Peter. It was Peter and Peter alone who stated, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." There it is. The charge has now been leveled against Jesus. And of course, it's this very charge, the blasphemy of calling oneself a God, which would eventually lead to Jesus' passion and his death. Now comes the courtroom portion of our story. And it comes here in the 17th chapter of Matthew at the Transfiguration. First, we need some reliable eyewitnesses, right? The gospel says Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain. So there they are, right up there on top where everybody could see. And Jesus was transfigured right in front of them, shining like the blazing sun. Can you imagine actually seeing something like that? I'd call that some pretty strong evidence, wouldn't you? But God didn't stop there, did he? No. The gospel says, "Behold, Moses and Elijah appeared, conversing with Jesus." There it is. The two most recognizable Old Testament representatives of both the Jewish law and the prophets. They appear right there on Jesus' behalf, and they're carrying on a conversation. What more proof would we need as to Jesus' identity? Well, I suppose in the legal world, we'd need some first-class reliable testimony, wouldn't we? Okay, how's this for a credible witness? The gospel says, "A bright cloud appeared, and a voice came from the cloud which said, 'This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him.'" Folks, this is not hearsay testimony. This is not circumstantial evidence. This is God the Father testifying to the authenticity of his only Son. Now, you tell me, how would you like to be sitting in that particular courtroom, trying to determine Jesus' identity? Would you need any more evidence? Would you require any more credible witnesses? Would you need to see or to hear any other firsthand testimony? Could there be any more reasonable doubt in your mind about who Jesus is, having witnessed these events yourself? Of course not. Of course not. Jesus gave us, his followers, this unquestionable, undeniable evidence of his divine nature, so that when our faith is tested to the limit, when we find ourselves in our darkest hour, when all of our hope has seemingly been lost, Jesus still has dependable eyewitnesses to testify on his behalf as our Savior. So before I close, I'd like to ask one more question, especially today as we celebrate our RCIA penitential rite with these candidates. What do you believe?